I never imagined I would spend a Saturday afternoon standing in my own field, watching tow trucks haul away 7 HOA members' cars, while a licensed auctioneer called out bids like it was a county fair. The truly shocking part wasn't the auction itself. It was the fact that everything I did was completely legal. I followed every statute, every ordinance, every line of their own bylaws. They spent months treating my land like their private parking lot, and in the end, the law gave me the final word. People ask me what pushed me to that point, but they never start with the real question. What kind of neighborhood drives a quiet homeowner to auction off his neighbor's property just to get his peace back? My name is Evan, and for most of the 5 years I lived at the edge of Pine Brook Hollow, peace wasn't something I had to chase. It was simply there, waiting for me every morning. My 3-acre parcel sat just beyond the subdivision's last paved road, separated by a line of tall oaks and the kind of gravel driveway that crunches under your boots in a way that feels like home. My house was modest, 2 stories, tan siding, metal roof that glimmered when the sun hit it, but it was enough. More than enough. Out back stretched 2 quiet acres of meadow and low woodland, the kind of open space where you could breathe without feeling watched, where the night sky wasn't dimmed by street lamps or porch lights. I spent more evenings than I can count sitting out there with Buck, my golden retriever, listening to wind move through the trees. And best of all, I wasn't under the HOA's authority. Not legally. Not technically. Not in any way that mattered. My parcel sat just outside the jurisdiction line, grandfathered in from an older subdivision before Pine Brook Hollow ever existed. The HOA sent me newsletters out of habit and waved politely when I passed them in town, but they had no power over my property. No architectural rules, no paint color restrictions, no mandatory fees. Nothing. It was one of those rare zoning quirks that actually worked out in a homeowner's favor, and for years, it kept my life simple. I knew of the HOA president, of course. Everyone did. Diane Whitford, mid-50s, crisp blazers, a voice sharp enough to cut paper. She ran the HOA with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. I saw her at the farmer's market a few times, always surrounded by board members who trailed her like ducklings. Our paths crossed, but never long enough for conflict. I kept to my land, and they kept to theirs. For a long time, nothing disturbed the quiet rhythm of my days. Mornings on the porch with coffee warming my hands. Evenings wandering the tree line. Weekends working on small projects or clearing fallen branches. My world was steady, predictable, untouched, until the day I pulled into my driveway and saw a silver Lexus sitting half in the gravel, half in my grass, as casually as if the owner had been parking there their entire life. I remember stopping, staring, trying to make sense of it. A stranger's luxury car on my land. No note, no reason, no permission, and I didn't know that one innocent Lexus was the first crack in a disaster waiting to happen. The Lexus should have been my warning, but at the time I convinced myself it was a mistake. Maybe a wrong turn, maybe someone visiting a neighbor. Maybe I was overthinking it. I tucked the doubt away and went on with my week, telling myself that people don't just park on private land without asking. Not in a neighborhood like this. Not where boundaries are supposed to mean something. But the following Friday, when I rounded the last bend of my driveway, reality hit me harder than the gravel popping under my tires. 2 SUVs sat in my field, not on the edge, not pulled slightly off the road. They were deep into the grass, parked side by side like assigned spaces in a makeshift lot. One had a Pine Brook Hollow decal on the rear window. The other had a cooler in the back seat and a stack of HOA pamphlets on the dash, the kind they pass out during meetings to remind residents of acceptable mailbox colors and the allowed height of decorative shrubs. I climbed out of my truck slowly, stunned. My field wasn't a road or a turnoff or a designated anything. It was my land, my private property. Before I could even form the words to question what was happening, a man in a blue polo shirt strolled past me, waving casually as if we'd known each other for years. The Pine Brook logo stitched on his chest confirmed he wasn't lost. Overflow parking, he said with a grin, gesturing vaguely toward the main road. Board meetings packed. I tried to respond, but confusion knotted my tongue. Overflow parking? On my property? Without so much as a knock on my door? By the time I managed to say, "Hold on," he was already walking off to join a woman holding a tablet, both of them chatting like nothing was wrong. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for the shock to fade, waiting for reality to reassemble itself into something that made sense. But it didn't. They had parked on my land as casually as someone parks at a grocery store. No hesitation, no remorse, no awareness that they were trespassing. I should have confronted them. I should have demanded they move the SUVs immediately. But I hesitated, caught somewhere between disbelief and not wanting to create conflict over what I hoped was a one-time mistake. I went inside, hoping the cars would be gone by the time I came back out. Hours later, their tire tracks scarred the grass in long, indifferent arcs. That was the moment the confusion settled into something heavier. Discomfort, a quiet but persistent unease. It clung to me like humidity, whispering that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else. Over the next few days, I caught glimpses of HOA board members driving past my property more frequently. Slow enough to look, quick enough to pretend. They weren't. It was subtle, barely noticeable unless you lived alone on a long gravel drive and paid attention to every unfamiliar sound. The signs were small, but they were signs all the same. A slow creep, a steady shift, a sense that lines were beginning to blur, just not in my favor. At the time, I brushed the feeling aside, telling myself I was imagining things. But truth has a way of showing itself whether you're ready or not. I had no idea they were about to turn my peaceful meadow into their personal parking garage. I woke that October morning to a sound no one living on 3 quiet acres ever expects to hear. The steady crunch of tires over gravel, again and again, like a convoy rolling through. At first I thought maybe someone had broken down near the entrance of my driveway. But when the noise didn't stop, when it grew louder, multiplied, layered into a chaotic hum, I stepped out onto the porch and froze. Cars, dozens of them. SUVs, minivans, sedans. A winding procession snaked down my driveway like they were entering a county fair. I watched in disbelief as volunteers in pastel cardigans and HOA polos waved drivers into my field with the same confidence you'd expect from people directing traffic at an event they owned. My field, the same one where I stargazed, where buck chased butterflies, where the world had always been quiet and mine, was turning into a parking lot before my eyes. I rushed down the steps toward the nearest volunteer, a woman with a clipboard and a practiced smile. "Hold on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What is all this?" She looked up, almost surprised to see me. "Oh, good morning. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. We're just using your lot for overflow today." My lot. Overflow. The words didn't feel real. "This is my property," I said, pointing at the cars now pulling onto the grass in orderly rows. "No one asked to use it." She blinked, checked her clipboard, and offered a sympathetic but empty smile. "You're Evan, right? The house at 7821 Ridgeview?" When I nodded, she added, "Right, you're technically non-compliant. Not part of the HOA, but still part of the old developer tract. The board voted on this. It's just for the Harvest Fair." The Harvest Fair. The annual HOA carnival with food trucks, bounce houses, live music, and enough foot traffic to fill them all. And without so much as a knock, they had decided my land was part of their event infrastructure. "I never agreed to this," I said, heat rising in my chest. "You can't just use my field. It's only for today," she replied dismissively, already turning her attention back to the arriving vehicles. "We assumed you wouldn't mind." Assumed. That one word carried all the entitlement I had been trying so hard to ignore. More cars kept coming. Parents unloaded kids with painted faces. Couples carried folding chairs and pumpkin spice coffees. Someone set up a portable speaker near the edge of my property line. My own land, the place I had chosen for its solitude, was now filled with strangers treating it like a public fairground. By evening, When the last car finally left, I walked through the field and felt my stomach knot. Tire ruts carved deep tracks into the softened earth. A decorative stone marker I'd placed years ago lay knocked over. 2 empty beer bottles glinted in the grass. Near the south corner, a section of wildflowers had been crushed under someone's tires. It wasn't just disrespect, it was intrusion, a violation I had allowed by staying silent too long. But the worst part wasn't the damage. It was what the clipboard woman had called me, so casually, like it meant nothing. And that day, for the first time, they called me something that changed everything, technically non-compliant. I thought the Harvest Fair incident was a fluke, an outrageous one, yes, but something that wouldn't repeat. I told myself people wouldn't dare treat my land like that again. I believed that for exactly 6 days, right up until the morning I walked outside and saw a sign staked into my own driveway, an A-frame, crooked and cheap, with a sagging cardboard face. But what made my stomach drop were the words, "Overflow parking, event at 108 Holloway. Thanks for understanding. Private property use permitted by Evan." My name, written in thick black marker. Not my handwriting, not my approval, not my anything. For a long, stunned moment, I just stared at it, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something sane. But they didn't. Instead, cars, fresh arrivals, were already rolling into my field, guided by pastel balloons tied to mailbox posts like breadcrumbs to a party I never agreed to host. I yanked the sign from the ground, heart pounding, and followed the trail. When I reached 108 Holloway, the scene looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Folding chairs, garlands of flowers, trays of cupcakes arranged neatly on tables, a bridal shower, and in the center of it all, wearing oversized sunglasses and a peach shawl, stood HOA President Diane Whitford. I held up the sign as I approached her. "You want to explain this?" She blinked once, slowly, then smiled with thin politeness. "Oh, Evan, don't tell me you're upset again. It's a bridal shower. We borrowed your space for a few hours." "I didn't give permission," I said. "Someone forged my name." Diane laughed. Actually laughed. "Please. No one is forging anything. We assumed you wouldn't mind. You never use that field." Her words hit harder than I expected. A dismissal wrapped in arrogance. As if my silence meant consent. As if my property existed for their convenience. Guests nearby paused in their conversations, glancing at me like I was interrupting something sacred. Diane waved them off, then added lightly, "It's hardly a big deal. Try not to make a scene." A scene. That's what she thought this was. Not trespassing, not forgery, not entitlement. Just me being dramatic. Humiliation settled in my chest like wet cement. I left before my anger said something I'd regret. Back home, I documented every car, every plate, every track in the grass. And just when I thought the day couldn't sink lower, my phone buzzed with notifications from the neighborhood Facebook group. Photos of the event. Videos, compliments. Shout out to Evan for letting us use his extra space. He's always so generous. We should give him a community award. Generous. That word twisted like a knife. They weren't just trespassing now. They were rewriting the narrative, turning me into a willing participant in my own disrespect. And I couldn't defend myself without looking like the angry outsider they'd already decided I was. I went to bed exhausted, defeated, and angrier than I'd been in years. But even then, I still wasn't prepared for how far they would push, because nothing prepared me for the envelope waiting on my door the next morning. The envelope taped to my front door fluttered in the morning breeze, bright yellow against the tan siding of my house like some kind of angry warning flag. For one foolish second, I hoped it was an apology, maybe an offer to repair the damage from the bridal shower, maybe, at the very least, an acknowledgement that the forged sign had crossed a line. But hope vanished the moment I tore it open. Violation, unauthorized signage in public view. Fine, $250. Issued by Pinebrook Hollow HOA Architectural Review Committee. I stood there, rereading the words, trying to make sense of the insanity. They had fined me for a sign I didn't make, didn't approve, didn't post, and had ripped out of the ground the moment I found it. A sign someone else forged with my name. The absurdity was almost unbelievable, almost comical, until the anger replaced it. Not only did they trespass, not only did they lie, but now they were punishing me for resisting, and that violation was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, new citations appeared on my door, like hostile little gifts. One for unauthorized terrain obstruction, referring to the small chain barrier I attempted to install across the edge of my field to keep cars out. Another for non-compliant exterior tone, a laughable accusation considering my home was built long before their paint guidelines existed. They fined me for excessive native vegetation, meaning the wildflowers I'd nurtured for years. They fined me for a mailbox that wasn't within regulation height, even though I wasn't under their governance. It didn't matter. They slapped notices on my door as if their authority extended to wherever their entitlement reached. And each time, the fines grew higher. I tried to fight back in small ways. I bought sturdy aluminum private property, no parking signs, and bolted them into wooden stakes. The next morning, every single one was gone, removed cleanly, not torn or vandalized, as if someone had come at night with proper tools, unscrewed the bolts, lifted the stakes, and walked away with them like trophies. I replaced them with larger signs. Those disappeared too, so I installed a chain barrier across the split in the gravel. It wasn't meant to block anyone completely, just to remind them they were crossing into private property. By sunrise, the chain lay neatly coiled beside the post, padlock untouched, deliberately unhooked, not cut, not broken, just mocked. Then things got worse. One afternoon, while I was repairing a loose board on the porch, Buck was lying in his usual sunny patch near the front steps when a black Jeep barreled partially into my field, spun around too sharply, and clipped him with its bumper. The yelp that tore from him still echoes in my mind. I sprinted toward the vehicle, but the teenage driver looked at me like I was the problem. "My mom said we can park here," he muttered, as if that excused hitting my dog. Buck limped for days, and then came the final blow. I turned on my irrigation system one morning and nothing happened. Confused, I inspected the control valve, then the main line. What I found made my chest tighten. Cracked PVC pipes in 3 places. Clean splits that could only come from deliberate pressure or direct hits. One sprinkler head had been ripped clean out of the ground. That's when the helplessness settled in. My land, my peace, my dog, everything felt under siege. And for the first time since moving here, I felt genuinely outnumbered. But in the middle of that frustration, something clicked with startling clarity. Then I realized they made one fatal mistake. They thought I didn't know the law. That night, after fixing Buck's bedding and checking the damaged sprinkler lines one more time, I sat at my kitchen table long after the house had gone still. Anger had carried me this far, but anger alone wasn't enough. I needed clarity. I needed leverage. I needed a way to beat them without lowering myself to their level. So for the first time since I moved into Pinebrook Hollow, I pulled out my old purchase documents, my parcel paperwork, and the dusty folder containing county zoning maps I had barely glanced at when I bought the place. What started as a desperate search for answers became something else entirely. At midnight, I logged into the county's online property archive. The system was slow, clunky, built like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, but buried in its endless layers was the truth the HOA never thought I would bother to look for. When I entered my parcel number, 487B, the screen loaded a map I must have scrolled past 100 times in the past without really seeing it. But this time, I saw everything. A bold jurisdiction boundary hugged the main subdivision, looping around every street and cul-de-sac of Pinebrook Hollow, but stopping nearly 30 feet short of my southern property line. I zoomed in twice, then again, heart thudding louder each time the map sharpened. My land wasn't just technically outside the HOA, it was completely excluded. Legally, permanently, explicitly. Their bylaws had no authority over me. Their citations held no legal standing. Their rules meant nothing on my acreage. Every fine taped to my door, invalid. Every warning, worthless. Every attempt to intimidate me, emptier than the clipboard smiles they used to hide behind. For the first time in months, my mind felt clear. But clarity turned to triumph when I found something else. Something golden. The HOA bylaws were public record, probably because they assumed no one outside the board would ever read them. But I read every line, every clause, every dull paragraph written in the flat, authoritative tone of people who believe their words can't be challenged. And there it was, buried deep in Section 6.7. Any vehicle parked on private property for more than 72 hours without explicit consent of the owner may be deemed abandoned and subject to removal at the property owner's discretion. My property, my consent, my discretion, and then came the final piece. County Ordinance 1428A. A vehicle left on private property without permission beyond 72 hours may be treated as abandoned and may be removed or liquidated through a publicly permitted auction, provided proper notice has been given. It felt unreal at first. I reread the lines again and again, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding anything. But it was all there, in black and white. The law wasn't their weapon, it was mine. The shift inside me was immediate and undeniable. I had spent weeks feeling violated, powerless, cornered. But now I had structure. Now I had options. Now I had a plan forming in my mind with sharp edges and solid ground beneath it. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to argue at board meetings or beg for respect. I would document. I would prepare. And when they made their next mistake, and they always made mistakes, I would be ready. All I needed now was for them to trespass again, and they never disappoint. Once I understood the law was on my side, my anger sharpened into something cleaner, steadier, more dangerous, purpose. I wasn't fighting blind anymore. I wasn't reacting to what they did. I was preparing for what I knew they would do next. And when people underestimate you long enough, they never realize when the balance shifts. The first step was proving the field was empty before anyone trespassed again. One crisp morning, just after sunrise, I walked the entire perimeter of my land with my phone, taking 360-degree videos and photos. I captured every patch of grass, every corner, every angle. No cars, no tire tracks, no overflow parking excuse waiting to be used against me. Just untouched meadow and the quiet that had once defined my life. Then I mounted 2 trail cameras on the oaks overlooking the driveway and the field. They weren't high-end, just motion-activated models with timestamps. But timestamps were all I needed. Proof of when cars arrived, how long they stayed, and who put them there. If anyone questioned my documentation, they'd have more evidence than they knew what to do with. Next came the notices. I spent an evening in my workshop printing, laminating, and sealing dozens of identical signs that read in bold red letters. Notice: this is private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be considered abandoned after 72 hours. Removal and disposal procedures will begin immediately thereafter under County Ordinance 1428A. I added my full name, address, and the citation number of the ordinance. Then I slipped each notice into a weatherproof sleeve, ready to place directly on any windshield that dared enter my land. But preparation wasn't enough, not for what I intended. So I drove to the county clerk's office and filed an application for a temporary private auction permit. Most residents never heard of such a thing, but rural landowners knew it existed. The process wasn't complicated, just obscure. Pay a fee, provide proof of property ownership, show documentation of abandonment procedures, and wait. The clerk stamped my paperwork, slid it back across the counter, and told me my permit would be active within 24 hours. The moment I walked out with that stamped approval, the weight on my chest eased for the first time in weeks. Then I made one more call. A towing company, 2 towns over. One that specialized in rural repossessions and didn't shy away from HOA disputes. The owner, Rick, answered in a gravelly voice. When I explained my situation, he chuckled and said, "Son, I've dealt with more HOAs than I can count. Just give me the time and date. We'll bring the flatbeds." I saved his number as Rick Towing Backup and felt something unfamiliar return. Confidence. By the end of the week, I had everything ready. A folder sat on my table, thick with printouts, my deed, the zoning map, photos, video stills, copies of bylaws, county ordinances, and the brand new auction permit tucked neatly inside. I kept a backup in my truck's glove box, just in case. And then I waited, not anxiously, not nervously, calmly, because for once, I wasn't the one about to be caught off guard. And then the HOA announced their next big event, right next to my property. The morning of the event felt strangely calm, almost peaceful, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the line of pastel banners and vendor tents go up near the entrance of Pinebrook Hollow. Their Spring Bloom charity event, another HOA spectacle designed to impress donors and remind the neighborhood who held the reins. I wasn't surprised when the first car drifted slowly toward my driveway, then another, then 3 more behind them. By the time I set my cup down, almost 30 vehicles had poured into my field in a steady stream, each one directed by smiling volunteers who never bothered to look in my direction. This time, there was no shock, no confusion, only readiness. I walked down the slope with my stack of laminated notices, the ones I had prepped with the accuracy of a surgeon preparing instruments. The grass was still wet from last night's rain, and I could see how the tires carved into it without hesitation, flattening what little regrowth had survived the last trespass. At the first SUV, I placed a notice under the wiper, then another and another. Each placement was methodical, deliberate, documented with a photo and timestamp. I didn't rush, I didn't raise my voice. I simply worked, car by car, row by row, until every windshield held the same warning: 72 hours. Remove it or lose it. About halfway through, I heard heels clicking on gravel. "Evan," Diane's voice called out, sharp as a blade wrapped in velvet. "Are you doing this again?" I turned to face her, the HOA president in all her irritated glory, arms crossed, tightly over her pastel blazer. She glanced at the notices and let out a dismissive laugh. "You can't seriously think these mean anything," she said. "You're making a fool of yourself." "I'm enforcing my property rights," I replied calmly. "Everything here is legal. Everything is documented." She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if delivering some parental reprimand. "No one is taking you seriously. You look unstable. This is a community event. Just let it go." But her words rolled off me like dust. The law was behind me. The evidence was ironclad. And Diane's confidence wasn't a threat anymore. Just noise. As I finished tagging the last vehicle, volunteers stared openly, whispering among themselves. A few residents pulled out their phones, probably recording, probably mocking. Sure enough, when I checked Facebook later that evening, the posts had already started. "Evan's having another meltdown. Someone needs to calm him down. Imagine being this dramatic about grass." But what none of them realized was that the countdown had already begun. Hour 1 passed, then 4, then 12. Most attendees left after the event wrapped up, though some drivers must have forgotten where they parked, or didn't care, because their cars remained in the field overnight. By the next morning, about a dozen vehicles were still there. I updated my logbook, snapped new photos, and went on with my day. By the end of the second night, more had vanished. People must have noticed the notices and panicked quietly, but a stubborn handful still remained behind, unmoved, untouched, and clearly abandoned. When the 72-hour mark finally arrived, I walked out to the field with my camera, documenting the scene one last time. And when the clock hit 0, 7 cars were still sitting on my land like abandoned trophies. By noon on auction day, the sky was a clear, sharp blue, the kind of weather that makes everything look cleaner, louder, more exposed. I stood at the edge of my driveway, listening to the distant rumble of engines approaching. For a moment, I wondered if the neighbors would think it was road work, or maybe utility trucks. But as the sound grew closer, deeper, unmistakable, I knew the truth was about to hit them hard. 3 tow trucks, 2 flatbeds and a rollback, rolled slowly down the gravel, engines growling like something out of a movie. People walking dogs stopped. Curtains shifted in windows. Doors creaked open. By the time the trucks turned into my field, half the cul-de-sac was watching. Rick, the towing company owner, climbed out first, clipboard in hand. "Morning, Evan," he said, tipping his head toward the cars lined up like offerings. "Ready to get started?" I nodded, my heart steady. This wasn't revenge. This was justice wrapped in paperwork and delivered with steel chains and hydraulic lifts. Let's begin. The first SUV was hooked onto the flatbed with smooth practiced efficiency. Chains clinked, metal groaned, and within minutes the vehicle was secured and lifted from the ground. That sound, the clank of finality, echoed across my land like an announcement. And of course, right on cue, Diane appeared. She stormed across the grass in a tailored blazer and heels that sank with every angry step. Her face was flushed red, her jaw locked, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't have that smug composure she liked to parade around. She looked rattled, afraid. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, pointing a trembling hand at the tow truck. "You can't touch those vehicles. You have no right." I lifted the folder I'd been carrying for weeks. "I have every right," I said evenly. 72-hour notices were posted. Documentation was filed with the county. "This is a lawful removal and auction." "You're out of your mind," she shouted. "This is HOA property." "It's my property," I corrected. "And your members left their cars on it long past the legal limit." She opened her mouth to argue again, but the sound of tires crunching behind us cut her off. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up the driveway, sunlight reflecting off its windshield like a spotlight sent to settle the argument. Sheriff Will Grady stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached. Diane practically lunged toward him. "Sheriff, stop him. He's stealing our residents' vehicles." Sheriff Grady raised a hand, silencing her with a calm that made her freeze. Then he turned to me. "You got the paperwork?" I handed him the folder. He flipped through it slowly. Deed, zoning map, photos, timestamps, notices, ordinance references, the auction permit. When he finally closed it, he looked directly at Diane. "He's within his rights," the sheriff said. "All procedures have been followed. These vehicles are legally abandoned." Diane's face drained of color. "You can't let him auction them," she said, voice cracking. "That's thousands of dollars worth of property. Then their owners should have moved them." The sheriff replied. That was it. No more arguments. No more smug comments. No more forged signs or fake violations. One by one, the auctioneer called out bids. The Tesla went first, sold in minutes. Then the Mercedes. Then the lifted truck. Each gavel strike was a closure, a restoration of balance I hadn't felt in months. The neighbors didn't speak. They watched, stunned, as their supposed authority crumbled in public view. By the time the last vehicle changed hands, the air felt lighter, almost clean again. But the auction was only the spark. The real explosion was still coming. The morning after the auction, I expected whispers, maybe even angry knocks on my door from the people whose cars now sat on someone else's trailer. What I didn't expect was the avalanche. By noon, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Not from the HOA, not from the sheriff, but from neighbors, screenshots, links, videos. Someone at the auction had filmed everything. The tow trucks rolling in, Diane screaming, the sheriff siding with me, the gavel hitting the table again and again. By sunrise, clips were already circulating in local Facebook groups. By lunchtime, they had jumped to Reddit. And by evening, one video titled, HOA President melts down as homeowner auctions members' cars legally had hit tens of thousands of views. I watched the footage of myself standing calmly beside the auctioneer while Diane raged in the background. In the comments, people weren't mocking me anymore. They were furious, but not at me. They were furious at the HOA. This is what happens when an HOA forgets homeowners have rights. Good for him. Someone needed to stand up to that board. Why was the HOA even using his property? It spread faster than wildfire. By the second day, the county's ethics office had opened an inquiry, not into me, into Pine Brook Hollow's HOA. The videos had been too public, too damning, too embarrassing for them to ignore. And once people started looking, the cracks in the structure widened faster than anyone could have predicted. It began with a few residents requesting a financial audit. Then a few more joined. Then a dozen. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood had signed a petition demanding a full review of HOA expenses. What they found wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was a maze of unauthorized charges, mysterious vendor invoices, duplicated fees, and payments to companies suspiciously connected to certain board members. The county investigation confirmed it. Misuse of funds, inflated landscaping costs, emergency charges billed to homeowners for services never actually performed. Even the pine straw mulch used every spring was being purchased at triple the market rate from a company owned by the HOA treasurer's brother-in-law. It was corruption, not dramatic, movie-style corruption, but the quiet kind that grows in shadows when no one's watching. And suddenly, everyone was watching. Diane was the first to resign. Her statement was posted in the community group. 3 paragraphs of blaming hostile behavior, false narratives, and unreasonable residents. But no amount of polished wording could hide the truth. She stepped down because she had no choice. Within a week, 2 more board members quit, then another. The remaining few tried desperately to hold meetings, to restore order, to pretend everything was normal. But no one showed up. No one trusted them. No one even bothered pretending anymore. The facade had cracked. The authority they carried like a shield was gone. Walking through the neighborhood felt different. People who once avoided eye contact now waved at me. Some stopped to talk. A few apologized, not for trespassing personally, but for not noticing what the board had been doing all along. Others admitted they had suspected things weren't right but never felt they had a voice. It was strange, seeing them turn to me, the man they once labeled a problem. So when an emergency community meeting was called, I went. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to hear the truth from their mouths. What I didn't expect, what I never could have imagined, was the moment they turned as one, looked straight at me, and asked the question that made my stomach drop. They asked me to lead. When the residents asked me to take a seat on the interim board, I hesitated. I had never wanted power. I had never wanted authority over anyone. All I ever wanted was to be left alone on my 3 quiet acres. But standing in that community hall, surrounded by people who had finally opened their eyes to the truth, I realized something. The only way to make sure an abusive system never rose again was to take a place inside it and dismantle it from within. So, I agreed. A week later, during the first meeting of the interim board, I was unanimously voted in as HOA treasurer. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, the man they'd once fined for a sign I didn't write, was now in charge of the books they'd weaponized for years. The ledgers were a mess. Receipts were missing. Transactions didn't match approvals. Vendor contracts were handwritten with signatures that didn't look consistent. It was chaos disguised as order. I spent late nights at my kitchen table, spreadsheets open, cross-checking every record with county archives and vendor registries. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that the corruption hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberate, selective, systematic, and the community deserved the truth. So we implemented reforms, fast. Every dollar spent required dual authorization. All vendors had to be approved through open bidding. Citations could no longer be issued anonymously. Every complaint had to be documented and reviewed by the board as a whole. We restructured fine policies, removed vague language in the bylaws, and eliminated the discretionary enforcement clause entirely. The same clause the old board used to target anyone who questioned them. But the real shift wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the people. Neighbors who'd avoided each other for years began attending meetings, actually talking, asking questions. Residents who once felt powerless now raised concerns openly without fear of retaliation. I saw fences being repaired, sidewalks being cleared, yards being mowed by groups of volunteers who didn't need fines or threats to take pride in their community. The fear that used to hang over Pinebrook Hollow like humidity was finally lifting. And that's when the biggest question surfaced, the one that had been brewing since the auction. Did they even need an HOA anymore? The room went silent the moment someone asked it aloud. For decades, the neighborhood had been told the HOA was necessary for order, value, beauty. But after everything we'd uncovered, after everything they'd endured, the truth was undeniable. Pinebrook was safer, cleaner, and more unified without them. So we voted. Ballots were delivered door to door. Informational meetings were held. Every resident had a voice, whether they were lifelong homeowners or newer families. And when the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. 82% voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. Just like that, the structure that had ruled Pinebrook Hollow with arrogance and fear collapsed. The bylaws evaporated. The fines died. The board disbanded. The power was returned to the people it belonged to from the start. We weren't a governed community anymore. We were just a neighborhood, a simple human place where respect mattered more than rules. I should have felt complete. I should have felt finished. After months of fighting, documenting, defending, and exposing, the war was finally over. And yet, as I stepped onto my porch that evening and looked out over my quiet field, empty, peaceful, mine again, I felt a familiar tug in my chest. Because even after victory, there was one last thing I needed to repair. When the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, as if a long-standing tension had finally snapped and drifted away like dust in morning sun. But the quiet I'd once known still wasn't fully back. Not yet. My field bore the scars of months of trespass, the kind of subtle damage only landowners understand. Crushed grass that never grew evenly, gouged tire ruts hardened by weather, and broken irrigation lines that hadn't been touched since the night someone sabotaged them. I realized that if this story was really going to end, I needed to restore the place where it all began. So on a cool Saturday morning, I walked out into the meadow with a toolbox in one hand and a coil of fresh PVC pipe in the other. Buck trotted beside me, his limp mostly gone now, his tail wagging in that full-body way only golden retrievers truly master. For weeks after he'd been hit, I'd watched him carefully, terrified that the damage was permanent. But nature has a way of healing what people break, given enough patience. He followed me through the grass as if reclaiming the field with every step. Fixing the irrigation system was slow, muddy work. I dug into the earth where the pipes had cracked, replaced each damaged section, tightened fittings, reset valves, and tested pressure until the water pushed cleanly through again. When the first sprinkler head finally popped up and sprayed a bright arc across the sunlit field, I felt something I hadn't felt since before all this began. Relief. A quiet, unspoken peace washed over the land. Something taken had been returned. Next, I turned to the small stone bird bath near the tree line, the one someone had knocked over and cracked during an event I never agreed to host. I found a new piece of stone on a trip out west months earlier, a smooth gray slab that reminded me of the ridge where I used to sit and watch the sky. I rebuilt the bath slowly, aligning each piece until it looked like it belonged. When I stepped back, it wasn't just repaired. It was stronger than before, heavier, more grounded. A reminder that some things are worth rebuilding the right way, no matter how long it takes. Neighbors passed occasionally as I worked, but now they stopped at the fence instead of wandering onto my land. They waved respectfully. Some offered help. A few apologized, not for anything specific, but for not seeing sooner what the old board had been doing. I accepted every apology with the same simple nod. I didn't need remorse. I only needed boundaries respected, and for the first time in a long time, that's exactly what I got. Buck ran freely again in the finished field, chasing squirrels and darting between the trees like he was rediscovering his own backyard. Watching him reminded me why I fought, why property rights matter, why silence is not surrender, and why the law, when understood and used correctly, is more powerful than any clipboard, citation, or manufactured authority. To everyone who has followed my story, let me say this clearly: know your rights, know your land, and never let anyone convince you that your peace belongs to them. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, share this video, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Your voice matters more than you think. And if anyone ever forgets what happened here, I still keep the notices, the documents, and the truth ready to remind them.